Okay, so what I wanted to do today is start with an unusual introduction. And some of you probably are wondering what this box is all about, because this box represents Dragos's best quote that I just love. So you know, people do say that in order to live in a box, eventually you throw up your arms in the air and you give up. And so people say, oh yeah, think outside the box. And that's what this guy is doing. And you make some progress. Dragos, on the other hand, says, throw away the box. And I love it because he told me about it some time ago. And you will see in the seminar that he's approaching a fundamental question about how rock develops into soil, which then develops into life. So that is, to me, really throwing away the box. Now, let me just introduce Dragos to you very quickly. Dragos Zaharescu came to us about 5 years ago. I think it's 5 years exactly, isn't it, in February. And he graduated, he earned his PhD at Kingston University in the UK, got a master's degree at a university in Spain, and he originally comes to us from Romania. So he is an international citizen. And in addition to that, his approach to things, if you read the publicity piece that I wrote about him, has spanned an incredibly interdisciplinary approach to the problem at hand. And that's all I want to say about him. He'll take the lead and tell us all about his work. By the way, he's a postdoc here, research associate at Biosphere 2 and SWES at the University of Arizona. So I hope you enjoy his seminar, and here he is.
Thank you so much. Indeed, I remember saying this, that it's better to get rid of the box than thinking outside the box, inside, and other places of the box. I'm a former biologist, so I did my undergrad study back in Romania in biology, in evolutionary biology, particularly in marine biology. Then I moved to Spain, where I did my master's, again in evolutionary biology, and I started my PhD that was in high altitude lakes, geochemistry, ecology, and I covered climate change too. So it really gave me an opportunity to see the world from high above, and also having sampled almost 380 lakes in the Pyrenees, it gave me a profound understanding of how the landscape influences the weathering, and how basically ecosystem starts high up there in the mountains. So what I'm going to present you today is my vision of what it's my take of this world, of what I understand, how the world works, how the soil forms, how the sediment forms, and how this translates into a living ecosystem. So I see the Earth as a life support system, and it continuously. I have a small technical problem now. I guess so. Okay.
You want to just say next slide?
Right. So is this fragile world that the atmosphere is at the right temperature, the water is at the right temperatures in the liquid form, and we have a rich rock substrate that is suitable for life, let's say it that way. So there is this cycle, biogeochemical cycle, that uses air, rock, and water to support life, right? So Earth is a life support system, and it continuously cycles this. Also, Earth is a bioreactor, right? It surfaces fresh molten lava, and it solidifies it, and then the interaction between air, water, and the solidified rock creates this biological weathering and releases the elements necessary to support life. So I want you to take just a few seconds, sit back, and think about this. So this is actually what Earth is. The crust, we know it, is only 1% of the volume of Earth. The rest of it is molten lava that it's a high temperature. And when this lava comes to the surface, it solidifies. It solidifies very quickly in terms of the glass. And like basaltic glass and basalt lavas are kind of quick cooling rocks. If instead this lava solidifies slowly inside the Earth crust, the elements have time to come together and create minerals, right? And this is how you form granite and rhyolite. And this happens every day in some points of the Earth where the crust is being regenerated. Obviously in other places the crust is being submerged into this lava lake, and there is where metamorphism, contact metamorphism happens. And we get other types of rock there, like schist. So we sampled. I'm going to stop this. So really it's a time evolution which climate, geology, and topography interact and initiate biological weathering. I had worked for my PhD at large-scale ecosystem formation. I tried to understand how ecosystems form in those high-altitude lakes, right? So I have a publisher that just got accepted this year, and we figured out that in this physical landscape in which the ecosystem that supports the ecosystem, about 21% is the hydrodynamics. This is the climate that influences the settling of the ecosystem. Then about a little bit less, 90% is the geology, geomorphology. So it's this chemical composition of the substrate that dictates what sits there and where. And about a little bit less is the topographic formation. We very well know that most of the mountain landscapes we see nowadays are resulted from the last glaciations. So that created the valleys and the shapes of the valleys, and those are very important and influence the setting of ecosystems. In this case, the high altitude lakes. And here I kind of tested this conceptual ideas and against the riparian vegetation composition, and you can see that they really predict that. So this is kind of large scale influence of the landscape on ecosystem development. Now, as soon as the rock starts to interact with water and life settles there, we have biological weathering. So microbes, plant roots, mycorrhizas start to interact with the rock surfaces and releases the nutrients that later on are part of the major biogeochemical cycle of elements. So we have here element complexation, organic matter formation, and organic matter complexate with major and other kind of elements to create these biocomplexes. And they later settle down and over time accumulate and form soils and sediments. It works. This is part of another paper in which I showed how all these large-scale factors, including altitude and latitude, big geographical scale factors, influences riparian communities and also the ecosystem that lives inside the lake sediments, right? So both, and the soils on the influences the soil formation on the lake boundary, and the sediment formation right inside the water. So we know that this interface between water and terrestrial area are the richest parts of the ecosystem generally, just because there's so much nutrient in there that can support an ecosystem. So this effect of weathering propagates across scales. Now, with time, as soils develop, soils has a life cycle, right? It's born, lives for an extended period of times, and eventually is going to run away through the water cycle. Is going to get deposited in lake bed sediments or even in the sea, right? So by studying this lake sediment, we can actually read, like in an open book, the history of the landscape that contributed water and sediments to that pool of water, right? So we can actually even infer the climate change effect, right? So this is another paper of mine in which in a huge watershed in the Pyrenees, we took sediment core and we demonstrated that climate change can actually increase the weathering of the landscape and at higher rates, and the solution of heavy metals, and it increases the heavy metals contribution to lakes over time. So over the last 30 years period. And besides, we found out that there was 30% reduction in the frequency of precipitation, which is huge for a climate change scenario. 30% reduction in precipitation over the last 30 years is a lot in the mountain landscape. So mountain landscapes and the catchments of mountain landscape can record all these climate and biogeochemical interactions that happen in the landscape. Okay, now one of the most important phases in biological weathering are the incipient stages of weathering, when microbes, mineral surfaces, and water interact and start to produce the transformation of primary mineral, the release of nutrients, and the contribution of these nutrients to the river stream and to the general biogeochemical cycle of the terrestrial system. So for the past 5 years, I focused my effort into understanding what happens right at the beginning when you put a microbe, plant, seeds, and mycorrhizae. We create different type of ecosystem from no ecosystem to simple and complex, and to see how each of these part of the ecosystem contributes to weathering and to the initial stages of soil formation. And the rationale behind that was that incipient rock biota interactions are among the most important phases in weathering soil or sediment genesis. And the earlier, the simpler, easier to study using the targeted questions and experiments. We very well know that soils are very complex systems, and it's difficult to disentangle cause effect and this. So if we start with something very, very simple, it's much easier to understand how the complexity evolves in time, right? If you understand the beginning, then it's easier to predict what happens next and to add more complexity as you go in time. But practically, this was I tried to do this after understanding what happens at big landscape scale. I wanted to see, okay, how does this start at small scale? How each component of ecosystem contributes to this large scale circulation. And the byproduct of this very early stage start the wider biogeochemical cycles, as I mentioned before. And I'll use it for understanding the scale effect. Okay, we targeted the micrometer scale, micrometer to organismal scale. So from the scale of minerals to the scale of a plant, and try to understand the stoichiometric element transformation in these early stages. There's a couple of questions that we came up with. What is the influence of substrate on weathering? We wanted to know if we have the same ecosystem or different substrates, how different rocks influence the development of the same ecosystem. Then what's the influence of ecosystem components? What is the influence of microbes on weathering and the denudation of the elements? What is the influence of plant what is the influence of mycorrhiza addition to the plant, then what is the influence of just chemistry. So we had an experiment that we started at Biosphere 5 years ago, and it took a year and a half to set up, just because somebody was mentioning at the GFIA last week in Abu Dhabi that there is something more boring than watching plants form. And I knew what was that, right? It's not that it's boring, it's just a huge effort. Earth takes thousands and millions of years to form soil and to accumulate it in a kind of a sufficient amount to sustain an ecosystem. And we wanted to understand this in a very, very short time. So to design a system that would keep control sterile and would keep microbes by themselves without being contaminated from the outside world, we had to design a long-term sterile pure growth chamber, right? So it took the design and the build-up. It took a year and a half, and you also had to use the rock and collect the rock from the field. Grinding, we had to remove the weathered surface of the rock. Grinding, sieve it, and sterilize it, which then we loaded into these columns. There were 288 columns. So we worked with about 1 metric ton of the 4 rock types: basalt, rhyolite, granite, and schist. And about only 20% of, or 15-20% of that rock was actually usable, was in the size fraction that we needed. So it takes Mother Nature tens of thousands of years to create a rock through physical weathering. It took us a year and a half to grind the rock and increase the surface area, right? And so we loaded these columns in the, this keeps vibrating for some reason. So we loaded the columns into six modules. We have purified air that comes through the modules to keep it long-term microbes and dust-free environment. And right at the input of the air, we have the sterile control. And as we go farther from the input, we had a mixture of, we had columns that had only microbes. Other columns had, we used grass and pine, so some other had microbes and the grass species, and others had microbes, grass, and mycorrhiza, an increasing order of complexity. And then we have microbes, pine, and mycorrhiza. Just to mention that we use 2 types of mycorrhizae, arbuscular mycorrhiza and ectomycorrhizae. So plants have been living in symbiosis with mycorrhizae since the very beginning, and almost 80 or 90% of the plant species on Earth still live in symbiosis with mycorrhizae. And what mycorrhizae do, they extend this hyphae that connect the root with the soil particles, right? And in our case, with the rock particles. And what it does, it mines for these specific nutrients that the plants need and gives back, and plants give back sugar. So it's a very interesting symbiosis that happens. So I wanted to understand what happens right at the beginning with mycorrhizae. Needs extra organic material to grow, or is just they are fine with what the plants provide them. So we added the seeds of the plants and the microbial inoculum that we extracted from basalt, from rock microbes. So we kind of brought it very similar to what happens in nature. Still, we keep it as a model system. Okay, so we have here the 4 rock types, the 6 biotic treatments, and here's just an example of the mycorrhizae that I was telling you about, the arbuscular mycorrhizae, and you can see here how it connects the seed with the rock grains. It's very, very interesting symbiosis, and this is under the microscope. And this is the pine and the pine mycorrhizae. Let's see if I can get it moving forward. There you go. That was the last slide. So before we started the experiment, just to mention that the water that we used to water the system was nanopure, so chemically grade water. So plants and microbes had as food of source only the rock itself. So we provided had no help. We had to characterize this to better understand what the mineral transformations that happened into the system. We had to well characterize the rock that we added in there. We did total digestion, and we did total elemental analysis of the three major group of elements, the major elements and the nutrients. We had trace elements, and we have the rare earth elements, which are part of the trace elements, but we studied apart, right? Just to understand how life interacts with the whole chemical periodic spectrum, right? So this is a electron microprobe analysis that shows, that shows the rock here on the left. In the center we have the rock grains that we use. It's size, sand size fraction between 250 and 500 microns, so a half to a quarter millimeter. And here are electron microprobe pictures that shows in different colors, different elements. In this case, aluminum is green, so you see the abundance of aluminum, you see the abundance of silica, which is red, and iron is blue. So based on this elemental analysis of the rock, we were able to identify which minerals are on the rock itself. And then we took other samples, took them to Stanford synchrotron, and analyzed. We did quantitative analysis of the mineralogy of the rock. So we have a comprehensive understanding of what we put in there first. Okay, I'm going to go directly to finding. How many minutes do we have? How much time? Fine. Okay. So the first and most impressive thing for me after a year and a half or 2 years of work to put a system that was feeding basically bare rock was to find out that the plants actually grew without the need of any additional fertilizers. And we had no problem with any fungi or any other parasitic organisms that could destroy our system, right? We had a small thing, but it did not. The plants were kind of healthy in themselves. They did not look very good, but they were definitely alive and they kept alive for 2 years until we extracted the last columns from the experiment, right? So that was a good thing to find out that an ecosystem actually can settle itself and start to grow on bare rock. So as far as quantitative results, we found that the biomass, the plants invested most of their energy in the below ground biomass. So the roots was by far the largest. Just to give you an idea, imagine a foot-long column that has, let's say, 2 inches of plant on the surface and 2 feet long roots on the ground. So that big was the difference in the root in the biomass allocation to root versus shoot, particularly in the size, right? So we had this plant. We scanned them. Yeah, we used the water tray. We scanned them and tried to understand if the root morphology has changed, having used the same plant on different rocks. We want to understand that, and we found out that they used different strategies, right? So plants, for example, plants that grew on basalt preferred to grow finer roots in abundance, while plants and so producing a relatively good biomass compared to the other rocks. And then plants on rhyolite use a different strategy. They grew thicker roots, less branching, and they produce the highest biomass, while plants on granite use the same strategy as for basalt, but they barely survive. So this gives a hint of what happens in nature when you throw the same seed in different places. It's not going to grow the same way. And eventually, if we keep doing this, this is what triggers evolution over time, right? If you use it, if it has a morphology that is adapted on the substrate, and we change, over time, climate and everything, that becomes a different species, became ingrained in the genome. This trait. Okay, now we further looked at how this plant morphology related to fine fraction production. So what we call fine fraction, it's practically the incipient soil. So it's those particles that get that get formed through nucleation of elements that get released from primary minerals. So they comprise secondary minerals. They comprise complexes of organic matter with elements and small particles. So that's the soil. So what we did, we removed the substrate and we washed it in alcohol to make sure we do not dissolve the water-soluble minerals. And then we waited. We produced very, 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 very small amounts of soil over 2 years period, like 1 milligrams or 0.1 milligram per 100 grams. Yeah. So here we show that we found a correlation between the fine fraction production and the total surface area, right? So the more surface area the plant had, the better it grew, the more fine fraction, the more soil produced. So this is kind of the first stages of soil formation where plant really contributes to soil accumulation. Right, so if we compare the rocks between them, we see that the schist has the highest, even the error bars were high, and this was due to very small amounts we were able to collect of the fine fraction. The schist was the highest, produced the highest amount of fine fraction than basalt and rhyolite. Basalt it has a glass matrix, and it's known in the literature that is the one that dissolves relatively fast because elements are not bound into stable crystals, so they can lose and they come out under weak acids relatively easy. Now, by looking at the effect of different biotic system, we see that even after 2 years, the effect was not significant, right? So basically, chemical weathering still dominated the biogeochemical processes that happened in our system. Basically, the mineral surfaces interacted with water and with potentially the weak acids that microbes and the plant roots produced, but the inorganic weathering kind of dominated. Mostly, we think it's been driven by the CO2 respiration, plant and microbe respiration, which is a major contributor to the increasing producing acid environment into the and pore space. Now, if we look at mass balance, at elemental analysis, so one of the question we wanted to ask is to see how much biotic system contributes to element leaching from the mineral and then incorporation to uptake into the plant and secondary mineral formation, right? So here you see results from the leaching results. So we have, I guess it's kind of very small, so I'm gonna zoom out. We have, I used 2 groups of elements I brought today to compare. We had papers on separate groups, treat them separately, but I wanted to compare to see how major elements that we know are very important in an ecosystem development, how they compare with rare earth elements whose role we don't really understand. So if you look at the major elements, you see this is in time, right? So this is concentrations in time. Water. Okay, so you see at the beginning, in the first, the x-axis is days, right? So we had like 600 days experiments run. So at the beginning, the first 2-3 months, for example, if we take sodium, which is the first column, potassium the second, and the manganese is the last one. Take sodium, we have a very fast release of sodium from the rock in the first 3 months. Then that slows down, right? So we kind of attribute that to the dissolution of the mineral surface. You know, when we break down the minerals, the first thing that happens is the chemical bonding, the chemical bonds break, and some of the elements have freely available alien energy, right? So those come free in the water, and they flush out first, right? So you kind of attribute that, and as the ecosystem starts to settle, you see there is less and less elements leaching in the water. This also means that a lot of elements have been uptaken by the plants and microbes. They are needed, right? The plants grow, and the only food sources are these elements that we analyze. And basalt, this happened in the old rock, so this kind of log scale, fast leaching at the beginning, and then kind of a steady state. And basalt, for potassium, which is a different element, it follows more or less a flat line, more or less. And manganese had a different behavior, so it kind of increases in some cases with time, which we do not fully explain how this happened, as we were still working on the paper. But we see different elements even within the major element class behave differently, and it is possible because of the rock being composed of different minerals. So different minerals dissolve at different rates, right? Salt is a mineral, and salt dissolves very fast, right? And the same way rock is composed of minerals, and some dissolve faster, some less fast. And if we look at rare earth elements, I'm sorry, this plot is plotted on a cumulative plot, so you have to think a little bit on how to compare to the major elements. But still, you can see in the first 3 months there is a sharp increase in denudation, followed by a flat line. And you also see here the influence of biotic systems. So with the blue line down is the control. So you see in all 4 rocks, control is kind of at the base, except on schist, where is a mixed feeling. So as you add microbes, the weathering and the denudation of these rare elements that we don't know how they interact with the ecosystem increases, right? And as you add plant, increases even more, and as you add mycorrhiza, increases even more. So it is a clear effect of biota on rare earth elements weathering. And this is the value that we plotted here were normalized to the original rock. So are not concentration, are normalized concentration. So it's kind of reflection of preferential denudation, right? So this is a preferential denudation. So you have a preferential denudation with microbes, and plants increase preferential denudation, and mycorrhizae add to that. Yeah, as compared to the major element, where the effect of biotic system was not that strong. And this is, say, very interesting finding. Let's see. Okay, when we try to incorporate all the elements in the weathering equation in a plot, it came up something very complex, because it incorporated the biotic fractions, and incorporated which is the green and orange kind of leaf color and root color, and we have water, and we have exchangeable fraction, the elements that are bound through weak bonding through to the grains, the substrate, and we have ammonium oxide extraction, and black is what it has been unweathered. So by comparing, you can see that in the case of major elements, the way I look at this plot, it's very complex, and each plot has different scale, just because it was impossible to put them on the same scale, right? So the way I look at them is compare the ratio between this fraction within the same column, and between the columns on the same plot, right? So kind of looking at these ratios, how they visually change from plot to plot. And you see, I choose only magnesium as example, because I would have ended up with too many plots here. So you see that that there is in basalt there is always an increase in the water in the leach fraction in the water with ecosystem complexity, right? And there is something happening in granite too, but in the other rocks it's not so clear. And this is basically because we're still looking at the initial stages of weathering. Even 2 years was not enough to create a very strong signal, right? So we still see overlapping between the system. Most of the elements are taken up on plant, and you can actually see this where the plant is. There is more, right? And an interesting thing is when you compare major elements, which are the major nutrients necessary for life distribution and this fraction, with the rare earth elements, the first thing I see is that in water there is much more leached in the case of major elements, and while in the case of rare earth elements, most of them are taken up on plant, right? Which is kind of unusual. We would expect that plant would not absorb. Obviously, there could be an explanation there. There's much more major elements in nature, so you will find more of them in the water. But it still, as a result, we have to still look at them. And there are differences between treatments. But is not a very striking difference. But however, this analysis allowed us to actually really understand how the weather elements distribute among the living and non-living parts of the ecosystem during incipient soil genesis, right? Incipient weathering, and we create a mass balance of what happens in the first 2 years in this case. Okay, so with this, the results show a shift from a strongly biotic signal to one dominated by biology within the 8 months of biota introduction. Then significant effect of plant presence on pore water chemistry was observed in the first months of experiment, and variation total denudation of the mesocost could be explained by could finally be explained by ecosystem complexity, and you could see how increasing complexity incremented the denudation and the uptake of elements. What can we take home from this? So the relevance is that this has a significant importance. This kind of study has a significant importance for understanding the coupling between living and non-living systems on Earth, and we were able to quantify the incipient soil genesis, the incipient weathering processes by doing the mass balance analysis, and this has potential applications extending wide on both Earth and space applications. Just recently returned from Abu Dhabi with Dr. Joe Coelho. We attended the Global Forum on Innovation in Agriculture, and at the end of this forum we had to create a recommendation list of where do we see agriculture going into the future. And there are many points in there, and a lot of them you guys are working on it, besides going to the moon. That's an interesting point too, right? But one of the points was that to better create a sustainable agriculture, we have to integrate agriculture and the natural processes that happens on Earth, including the human being as part of this, right? And the lifestyle we have. So it is important to incorporate the soil formation and soil cycle processes into our decision making. Not only to go there, use the soil, abandon, and move on, because we run out of surface to do this. So we have to understand how soil forms naturally and use natural principles to keep it sustainable, including, for example, using natural fertilizer. If we know that rock can support soil formation, the simplest way possible, we go out there and crush rock that contains the mineral, the right minerals that the soil we want to amend with is made of, and we crush it, powder, we turn it to powder, we amend the soil in this way, and those minerals dissolve over a longer time, going to support being able to support the agriculture over long run, right? And another application is the space colonization by local resources use, and I know Dr. Giacomelli was very happy to hear that. And you basically you can use the local rock on either on the moon or on the Mars to create agriculture. Okay, there are problems in there to solve, but we now know that we can grow stuff on bare rock, right? So using purified water, and we know that the chemical composition of basalt on the moon and the basaltic rock on Mars is very similar to our basalt, so there's no problem in them, and we just have to trick it a little bit more, maybe incorporate algae in our process, and we can actually release the nutrients from that rock and incorporate it into the food, and we would eat in the end the food produced on Mars. Right? That would be a sustainable way of colonizing the space without the need of carrying the bag of food from fries with us. And with this, I'm going to leave you with these two pictures, which very well exemplify what I meant by the last statement. So these are taken, one you know where, and the other one you know where too. No.
You should tell everybody.
Okay. One is on Mars by our rover there, and the first one, the left, and the one on the right is the Flagstaff, northern Arizona. So it's very close to us. It's the place we actually collected our rock from. So it's pretty similar, right? You see the oxidized layers on the surface on Mars, and the oxidized layers are a little bit of vegetation on Earth. But I would say they are compatible. And thank you so much. I want to thank the whole team that contributed to what I have shown you, and there were a lot of people, 50 people. I didn't have time to add them all on a list, but I'm deeply thankful to all of them and all their contribution. And
Thank you, Dragos. That was excellent. I may have pointed to the one on the left that looks like a hazy day in Arizona, you know, when the wind's blowing and the dust is up. So I could have mixed them up.
yeah.
You would have convinced me.
So similar.
There must be some questions. Let's have a few questions here. This man, you're welcome to say your name and have your question.
Jack Hughes, it's a pleasure to respond to this excellent presentation. There are a number of issues that come up with closed environment agriculture, which in some cases has no soil, and aspects of hybrid systems for which there can be interfaces with fish or can be interfaces with various types of plants. And one thing that we got into in an email discussion this week was advanced nanomembranes and where do they serve in terms of specialized applications to special types of agricultural product development. You know, one of the things that the human asks is, are we being cost effective in enhancing nutrition and taste of products? And would you like to comment on the issue of what you're either taking away when you raise plants under the circumstances of Biosphere and artificially adding something, or where are you coming at something for which the soil is better, the plants are better, human nutrition is better, it's a win-win-win? Have you given that thought, and would you like to comment?
Right. So you would like me to compare advanced high-yield agriculture with natural based agriculture? That's what you mean? I just want to make sure I don't slid away. which is so easy nowadays. Yes, taste is very important, right? It's more and more important. And I think naturally we have ingrained in our gene the preference for good taste, right? So we had to choose in our evolution foods that tasted good, right? So we kind of go into the same direction right now, with particularly with organic farming, right? Now, as far as this chemical additives, right, to
Or natural filtration.
natural, what do these nano filters come into the
But one of the
story?
things that comes to mind is, one thing that comes to mind is some people today like to say, am I getting enough calcium in my
Right.
diet?
Right.
And in essence, soil contains calcium, as you
Right.
pointed out, sodium, potassium, magnesium, etc. Now, the issue of marketing would say, we now are selling you tomatoes or lettuce that's high in calcium, and it tastes better, just as it is. There is a gentleman I had breakfast with today who loved to eat raw cucumbers. Now, can you actually use anything that you're learning at Biosphere 2 to create better taste and better nutrition of raw cucumbers that people will love 5 years from now?
Okay, I think there's you're right? It's a marketing strategy, right? When you run out of options on how to best sell your products, you get into chemistry and you advertise calcium and other things, right? I think if a plant is grown using natural life cycle, let's say like that, not forcing it into high temperature and genetically destroy it, to say it enhances, right, to produce only the type of tomato that has that size and that color, right? If you use natural ways, I think the food will always taste better. Okay, if there is limitation in nutrients, you can easily see it, the plants producing less yield, right? So you can enhance, again, using natural sources of calcium, right, or natural sources of other limiting nutrients. I think we use that before the agricultural revolution. We use like phosphates from Chile, right? Now, obviously, technology is going to play an important role, and how it's a win-win, right? It's a middle way, right? And how much you want the technology to 3D print your tomato, or how much you want the tomato to grow, using its own natural cycle, not forced, right? I don't know if I responded any ways of your.
There's a question from online,
right?
And it's the perennial problem. Where does the nitrogen come from in your system?
Yeah, good question. That we had actually.
We know without nitrogen we won't have plant growth.
Exactly. That was one of our main concerns, and one of the main critique that were brought, that we're not going to grow anything without nitrogen. And my response to that was, okay, we're going to add the seeds of the plant in there, right? So as soon as the seed wakes up, it knows nothing about nitrogen. It's just gonna adapt itself to the level of nitrogen that is in there. Now in soil we have nitrogen is fixed using nitrogen fixing bacteria, right? That most of them we know they live in symbiosis with legumes. They create those nodes and they fix. They initiate the nitrogen cycle. But there are some microbes that are free living microbes. So we think, since none of our plants were nitrogen-fixing plants, we think that the free-living microbes have those are responsible for initiating the nitrogen cycle. And we know that nitrogen there is 60% nitrogen, so there is a source of nitrogen in there.
What were your findings on the role of Mycorrhizae in your experiment? Is it essential to plant life?
Mycorrhizae in our experiment, it seems they were doing okay, but they were not improving the plant. Now, mycorrhiza it's a win-win symbiosis between plant and the fungi, right? And the right conditions. Our conditions were poor in nutrients for both mycorrhiza and plant. And my take on that is that there is some sort of competition in which both were struggled to survive. There was at the beginning, in the first semester, call it, in the first 4 months, there was an enhanced element uptake in plant growth under mycorrhized grasses, but later on that diminished. So it looks like there was a struggle, a competition for both sides of the story to keep themselves alive. Now, in the pine case, I think with a high chance we did not have actually a mycorrhizae infection. So we will see. We were not able to identify the mycorrhizae on the when we remove the structure that you normally expect that to find on the pine roots. So we'll see that. So it's difficult for both plants and mycorrhizae. So who is the best wins, and the other part of the symbiosis tries to keep alive.
What's the role of meteorites in the formation of the Earth, which is mostly iron?
Of the meteorites?
Yeah, and on the topology.
Right. Yeah, Earth is made of meteorites, basically. Long ago, many meteorites came together and collapsed. And, heavier elements went deeper. So we have an iron core, and lighter elements form the crust. So we have all kinds of meteorites, right? There are iron meteorites, iron nickel. There are rock meteorites, chondrous meteorites, I think. Yeah. So they brought the elements, and Earth is made of meteorites that initially came out from an explosion of supernova. So, yeah, we're made of stardust.
Okay.
We eat the stardust.
Dragos, thanks for your seminar. I
Thank you.
suppose, I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but let me start by saying that I guess the story that you shared with us today really is a story of two parts. You have the biotic and you have the abiotic. You have the rocks and you've got the plant life, or the biotic components. And I suppose as far as the rocks are concerned, from their point of view, the presence of biotic factors is bad news for them, right? Because it results in their faster degradation.
Yeah, if they would have feelings.
Right, and it seems to me like the presence of biotic factors really they're the engineers. They re-engineer their surroundings,
Exactly.
the biotic environment within
True.
them, to make them suited to their survival and to their thriving. Is that an accurate observation?
Exactly. That's how I looked at my system too. It's the life created its life support system.
Yes.
And it's a nice philosophical way to look at Earth itself.
So the biotic factors really are the engineers of terraforming.
Exactly.
So the question is, of all the experimental treatments that you have, which one resulted in the fastest rate of soil genesis? And how would you try to contextualize that for us in terms of the rate of soil genesis that you obtained in your experimental system compared with what's happening in nature and so on and so forth. Try to give us perspective on that. Thank you.
I have not compared yet to what happens in nature and the natural environment. But
Yeah, is it faster or no?
It is faster than in the natural environment.
Yes. Is your system faster than the natural environment?
I think it's, again, there are two options there, which I think, right? One, it is...
You're a politician on us today? Come on now.
No, that's part of the quantum thinking, right? It can be quantum theory. It can be both or none at the same
It
time.
could be a wave or a particle. Yes, we understand that. But I can't eat a wave nor a particle. Let's make plants here.
Let's make plans. So,
No pressure. No pressure.
no pressure. Of the four, I will start from what we know, right? Of the four rocks rhyolite and schist seem to have had the fastest rate of fine particle production that we would call soil. Now, of these two, rhyolite had the highest biomass. So I would say in terms of ecosystem formation is the rhyolite of the two rocks from our system. Now, it is a very controlled system in our case, in which we limited our system to basically the rock itself. In nature, there is a little bit more help. The rain carries dust, and dust is high in phosphorus. The rain carries carbon dioxide dissolved as an acid, so acid dissolution of the bedrock is important. Now, if the rock surface is, and then there's another side of the story in the nature too. The rock is less granular unless you have sand deposits where you can kind of compare to what we have here. So it takes longer to Earth itself to physically introduce cracks into the structures of the bedrock and disintegrate boulders and move them down with the river streams and polish them and crack them further. So it's much longer. So the story is complex. Now, if you're thinking on this and whether it's possible to use it in space applications or on Earth in an engineered environment, is that where your target question kind of was? Yeah. I think in an engineered environment we can help. We can help by adding just a little bit more of organic matter, or a little bit of just organic matter. By the organic matter decomposition would increase enormously. And I had a test on this. I added a very small fish on the surface of. That's anecdotal, right? But it just tells the truth. So it was dry on the surface of basalt that I had growing some tomato on it, and the roots came out and covered the fish, and that tomato grew much faster. So if you help the system just a little bit, you would be able to increase the weathering and soil formation rates, maybe above the natural system. Right?
While we're at the fish, what was it that specifically, do you know, what affected the growth, that the proteinaceous material of the fish? Any idea?
I have no idea, but I know in Antarctica they have. There was a study in which they found grasses living out of oils from decomposing, resulting from that was preying on. It wasn't fish, it was something else. Again, it was a protein, right?
But before we get away from this, I could like to ask about the basalt rock. Pat Roba, what do we use basalt rock for, or we used to? There's a material called rock wool that's been developed for the root zone media for growing plants. Is it possible that we've been creating additional
nutrients?
Yes.
Oh yes,
nutrients
of course.
For the plant.
Yeah. Basalt is mostly a glass matrix, and the minerals inside the basalt is 20 microns or less big. So the first thing that dissolves away is that. So it's a high surface area basaltic wall, and indeed you introduce some phosphorus, some extra nutrients from much more than glass wall. Yeah.
Next question.
One other aspect of what you may have learned from this is related to reconstitution of contaminated soils. And we have tailings here in the areas where we've extracted copper, and we've left behind the tailings and sometimes use arsenicals to do a secondary extraction. And up in the north part of Arizona, we have uranium tailings that are a problem. And if you were to say the optimization would say, can we convert this back into healthy soil that you can grow healthy plants in to serve a sustainable society? What would you say that you've learned from your experiments that's applicable to that challenge?
Thank you for the question. Actually, I work with two groups on campus that dedicate most of their effort into solving the mine tailings problems from both geochemical perspective and biological, microbiological perspective. Now, I can't talk for them because they have much more detailed information. My take from what I learned from this experiment and from what I know is that it's a difficult problem to solve because plants don't grow easy on those substrates. Okay, you can amend them, put organic matter, but in Arizona it's dry and hot, and unless you create these kind of conditions that will allow to plant. And then trace heavy metals are those kind of elements in the periodic table, which in small amounts they are beneficial, but just a little bit above the threshold they're toxic, and that's where the problems comes from. So yeah, they have been successful at stabilizing the soil, and that's a good outcome of vegetating mine tailings. And some plants have grown, and it also protects wind erosion, which is a big problem in Arizona. But as far as growing vegetables on it or something that you can use, I doubt it.
I have one more, if I could. I have one more question. Yes, we're getting applause already. It's 5:20 here, almost on a Friday afternoon. You start off by saying that Earth is a bioreactor.
Right.
And that really hit me.
How
And
hard?
then you went on to say, sorry?
How hard?
How hard? No, in a positive way. You went on to say about all the natural processes. But when I think of a bioreactor, I think of an engineered process.
Right.
And I like controlled process, as you know.
Yeah.
Natural processes sometimes can't keep up with modern society and numbers of people that we need to feed.
Right.
What was your meaning that, and I'm about Earth as a bioreactor, and speak to the young people that are out there, that I hope are out there listening. There's over 40 people online, and
Wow.
there may be some young people. Speak to them. What do you mean by Earth as a bioreactor?
Right. Yeah, Earth engineers itself, and it had evolved this capacity over millions of years, and it reaches nowadays into a balance in which what you get is what you take out. Right? So what you put in is what you take out. That's the meaning of bioreactor that I take, right? So the life itself bioengineered the rock to create a life support system, right? And then adapted itself to this life support system. So created this balance in which everybody, are more or less in balance with each other. Okay, there is a fight for phosphorus, for example, but this has evolved in the ecosystem, right? The lower level of the ecosystem are the ones that the first disintegrate the rock and pick up the phosphorus, and then as you go higher into predators and higher level of the food traffic, the phosphorus concentrations increases, right? But this is just the way the ecosystem has organized itself to keep to keep itself in balance with the Earth. Now, what happens is the humans we have evolved a way to bypass this balance. We created our own balance, our own society. That what we think is balance is, it's what we created a separate, a parallel universe to what happened on Earth, and we have not managed to integrate both systems, human society with a balanced Earth, and hence we have the mine tailings problems, we have climate change problems. We engineered the climate, right, in the wrong way, and now we have to reverse engineer into the natural. These are big things because we have practically covered the Earth and into this modification.
Excellent. Thank you.
It's not a rebuttal, but I just would like to add an insight to that because bioreactor is part of my expertise. So in general, when you operate a bioreactor, you operate in such a way that the settings of the environment inside the bioreactor is conducive to that biological agent that you're growing inside the bioreactor. But with the earth being a bioreactor, it's got a special meaning because the life forms, the biotic forms or agents that are being grown within the earth as a bioreactor has grown well enough that they have taken control of the bioreactor.
True.
That they now control the settings of the bioreactor to such an extent that it becomes really optimal for their thriving and their production.
That's a very deep meaning, and I totally agree with that, and I take that. That hits me. That hit me.
That sounds very good. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you for your time and for that
Thank you so much.
presentation. And for everyone, let's have some applause here. And thank you for attending. We will see you in about 4 weeks. The last Friday of March is our next Covering Environment Seminar speaker. And we'll look forward to you attending it again at that time. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you
good
so
weekend.
much.
Before he gets away, I need to visit. I want you to stick around.
Okay, one of the